That night, in the emergency room of a large hospital in Chicago, a billionaire female CEO was rushed inside after a serious accident. Blood on her hands, her breathing growing weaker. She gripped the nurse's hand tightly and whispered a sentence that made the entire room fall silent. "Please, just don't let me be in pain." But the strangest part was not the accident. It was the fact that the first person who ran in to save her was not a doctor. Just a night shift security guard. Someone most people in the hospital did not even know by name. No one in that room knew that ordinary man had once saved dozens of lives on the battlefield. And in just a few minutes, he would save another life. The life of the richest woman now lying on the stretcher in front of him. His name was Michael Carter, 42 years old, a night shift security guard at Mercy General Hospital located in the heart of downtown Chicago, a place where ambulance sirens rarely stopped wailing. Every night, at exactly 10 p.m., Michael stepped through the hospital's large glass doors. He nodded to the receptionist, hung his worn jacket over his shoulder, and began his familiar shift. His job was nothing special, walking along long hallways lit by fluorescent lights, checking emergency exit doors, watching the emergency waiting room where worried families sat for hours. Sometimes he helped an elderly patient push a wheelchair. Sometimes he brought water to someone waiting for test results. And sometimes he stood quietly at the corner of a hallway, silently making sure everything was still okay. To most people in the hospital, Michael was just the night security guard, the polite man who always held the door for people, the man who rarely spoke much, the one who, if he didn't show up one day, probably wouldn't be noticed right away by very many people. But there was one person who always noticed. In the small cafeteria on the first floor of the hospital, almost every night, a little girl was sitting at a table near the window. Her name was Lily Carter, 9 years old, a fourth-grade student. Every evening after school and dinner, Lily often came to the hospital with her father. She sat doing homework, sometimes drawing colorful pictures in her small notebook, hearts, stars, and many drawings of a man in a jacket standing next to a smiling little girl. At 6 a.m., when the shift ended, Michael would return to the cafeteria. Lily would usually look up and smile brightly. "Dad, are you done?" Michael always ruffled his daughter's hair. "Done, kiddo. Let's go home." The two of them would walk together through the parking lot, still covered in early morning mist, as the sun just began rising behind Chicago's tall buildings. Those simple mornings were the thing Michael treasured most in his life. Very few people in the hospital knew that before wearing this security jacket, Michael had lived a completely different life. He had once been a combat medic in the U.S. Army. For nearly 10 years, Michael served in places where gunfire and helicopters were part of everyday life. Afghanistan, scorching deserts, dusty field bases. There, his mission was very simple, yet brutally demanding. Keep others alive. He had pulled teammates out of gunfire. He had bandaged wounds in the dark. He had performed emergency treatment while explosions echoed and sand whipped through the air. For those actions, Michael received the Bronze Star with Valor and the Purple Heart. But he rarely talked about those medals. To Michael, those small pieces of metal were not victories. They were memories. Memories of people who never came home. 6 years ago, his life changed completely. Not on a battlefield, but on an ordinary road in Chicago. His wife, Emily, died in a car accident. In a single evening, Michael went from being a soldier to becoming a single father. He left the military not long after that, not because he no longer had the courage to face danger, but because every night when Lily fell asleep, he realized something very clearly. The world might need more heroes, but his daughter only needed a father. So Michael chose a quiet life, a simple job, a night shift, and morning walks through the parking lot with his daughter. A life so ordinary, it was almost invisible. But sometimes, the people who seem the most ordinary, they are the ones who appear at exactly the right moment when someone needs saving. And on a cold, rainy night in Chicago, that moment was about to arrive. That night, Chicago was sinking under a long, cold rain. Raindrops tapped steadily against the asphalt of Lakeshore Drive, reflecting headlights into blurred streaks. Near midnight, the city was still awake. Traffic had begun to thin, but in downtown Chicago, ambulance sirens rarely stopped. Inside Mercy General Hospital, everything was proceeding as usual. Michael Carter was standing near the emergency department entrance, checking the security camera monitor mounted on the wall. A nurse hurried past, pushing a cart filled with medications. A family sat in the waiting area, exhausted after hours of waiting. Then the radio clipped to his shoulder suddenly crackled with a familiar burst of static. Incoming trauma. Car crash on Lakeshore Drive. ETA 3 minutes. Michael slightly raised his head. 3 minutes. In an emergency room, 3 minutes could sometimes be the difference between life and death. From a distance, the sound of an ambulance siren began to rise. At first, just a faint noise through the rain, then quickly becoming clearer and more urgent. The automatic glass doors of the emergency department slid open. The stretcher was pushed inside so quickly that its wheels almost slid across the floor. 2 paramedics from the Chicago Fire Department followed behind, their voices tense and hurried. Female, mid-30s, high-speed collision. Possible internal bleeding, blood pressure dropping. The woman lying on the stretcher was wearing an expensive coat that had been torn at the shoulder. Blood ran down her arm. Her face was pale under the cold white lights of the emergency room. Michael glanced at her face and immediately recognized her. Rebecca Lawson, CEO of Lawson Biotech, one of the most powerful businesswomen in Chicago. Her name often appeared in business magazines, at technology conferences, and on the 40 under 40 lists that the media frequently discussed. But right now, nothing about that woman looked like a CEO. Just a human being struggling to breathe. A nurse bent down to check the wound, her expression growing tense. "Where's Dr. Grant?" Another voice answered from behind. "He's stuck in traffic, 5 minutes out." 5 minutes. For someone losing blood, 5 minutes could feel like an entire lifetime. Rebecca slowly opened her eyes. Her gaze blurred as she tried to focus on the figures moving around her. She reached out and grabbed the hand of a nearby nurse. Her voice was so weak it was almost just breath. "Please, just don't let it hurt." The sentence was so quiet it was nearly swallowed by the sounds of machines in the emergency room. For a few seconds, the room grew unusually silent. The nurses exchanged worried glances. There was no doctor. Not yet. Michael stood a few steps away. He looked at the wound, at Rebecca's shallow breathing, at the blood slowly soaking into the white sheet. Part of him recognized what was happening. Another part reacted before he had time to think. Michael stepped forward. "Let me help." A nurse turned to look at him, slightly startled. "Your security." Michael nodded gently, his voice calm. "I know." Then he added, slowly but firmly, "I used to be a combat medic." Those words made the room fall silent for a brief moment. Outside the doors, the rain continued to fall. Inside the emergency room, time was moving faster than usual. Michael stepped beside the stretcher. He looked at the woman, slowly losing consciousness in front of him. A very old memory suddenly returned to his mind. Nights on the battlefield when a soldier lay in front of him and everything depended on decisions made within a few short minutes. Michael took a deep breath, then said quietly, "Okay, let's keep you with us." And in that moment, the night security guard of Mercy General Hospital was no longer just a security guard anymore. The moment Michael Carter stepped beside the stretcher, he seemed to become a different person. No longer the quiet security guard who patrolled the hospital hallways. No longer the ordinary man everyone was used to seeing each night. In that moment, the soldier he once was had returned. Michael bent down, his hands moving quickly but with remarkable precision. He checked Rebecca's pulse at her wrist, weak, irregular. He looked at the nurse beside him. "Gauze, press here." The gauze was immediately placed into his hand. Michael pressed firmly against the wound on her arm to stop the bleeding. Blood soaked through the white fabric almost instantly, but the steady pressure of his hands began to slow the flow. In his mind, everything moved in a familiar rhythm. Assess the condition, stabilize breathing, keep the patient conscious. Steps he had performed hundreds of times in far worse circumstances. Rebecca moved slightly. Her heavy eyelids opened once again. The white lights of the emergency room made everything feel blinding. The figures around her were moving too fast. She tried to say something, but her breath was so weak the words almost fell apart. Michael leaned closer. "Hey, stay with me." His voice was deep, steady, and strangely calm amid the tension in the room. Rebecca tried to focus on the face in front of her, a face she did not recognize. Not a doctor, but the man's eyes carried a calmness that somehow made her feel safe. Michael gently held her hand. "Focus on my voice, okay?" He spoke slowly, clearly, each word deliberate. "You're going to see the sunrise." Rebecca frowned slightly as if she did not fully understand the sentence. Michael continued, his eyes never leaving hers. "I promise." No one in the emergency room knew why, but his voice seemed to soften the tension in the air. Rebecca looked at him once more. There was something in the way he spoke, like a promise that had been tested many times before. Her breathing slowed. Michael continued working. He checked her breathing again, placing a hand on her shoulder to keep her alert. "Tell me your name." Rebecca blinked several times. "Rebecca?" "Good." Michael nodded slightly. "Rebecca, you were in a car accident, but you're still here. Just keep breathing with me." He inhaled slowly. "Like this." Rebecca tried to follow. Inhale, exhale. In one corner of the room, a nurse glanced at the monitor and quietly exhaled with relief as the readings began to stabilize. Time passed so slowly that everyone could almost feel every second. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes. Then the emergency room doors swung open. Dr. Samuel Grant finally arrived. He quickly stepped toward the stretcher, glancing at the monitor. His eyes paused for a moment, then he looked at Michael. "Who stabilized her?" A nurse pointed toward the man who was still pressing the gauze firmly against the wound. Michael took a half step back as the medical team began to take over. "Just keeping her breathing, Doc." Dr. Grant looked again at the monitor readings. Then he spoke, his voice low but clear. "You didn't just keep her breathing." He looked directly at Michael. "You saved her life." Michael did not respond. He nodded slightly as if it were something very ordinary. As Rebecca was pushed into the operating room, she turned her head one last time. Her eyes found Michael standing at the end of the hallway. Her lips moved softly. "Thank you." Michael stood still under the hallway lights. He nodded gently, then turned and walked away. Just a few minutes later, the hospital hallway became quiet again, as if something very significant had just happened, but the person who made it happen never needed anyone to know. The next morning, gentle sunlight streamed through the wide window of a patient room on the top floor of Mercy General Hospital. Rebecca Lawson slowly opened her eyes. Her head still felt slightly dizzy. A dull ache ran along her ribs. Her arm was tightly wrapped in neat layers of white bandages. The heart monitor beside her released steady sounds. Beep, beep, beep. But she was alive. For a few seconds, Rebecca lay there staring at the ceiling, trying to piece together the scattered memories from the night before. Streetlights flashing across the windshield, the sharp sound of metal crashing, the rain, and a calm voice rising through the panic. "You're going to see the sunrise." Rebecca frowned slightly. She remembered that sentence very clearly. But who was the man who said it? The door opened softly. A nurse stepped in to check the machine's readings. Rebecca turned her head slightly. "Excuse me." Her voice was still hoarse. "Last night, there was a man before the doctor arrived." The nurse smiled gently, as if she had expected the question. "Oh, you mean Michael?" Rebecca blinked. "Michael?" "Yeah," the nurse nodded. "One of our night security officers. He kept you stable until Dr. Grant got here." Rebecca was silent. A security guard. Not a doctor, not a nurse. A night shift security guard had kept her alive until the doctor arrived. Rebecca looked out the window where the morning sunlight poured between the tall buildings of Chicago. A strange feeling passed through her. Not quite surprised, not exactly gratitude, just an emptiness she couldn't quite name. Around noon, her assistant, Daniel Brooks, walked into the room with a phone and tablet in his hands. His face still carried traces of concern. "Miss Lawson, thank God you're okay." Rebecca slowly sat up, wincing slightly from the pain in her ribs. "The board has been calling all morning," Daniel continued, "and the media already knows about the accident." Rebecca exhaled softly. "What are they saying?" "Mostly asking whether anyone else was involved," Daniel replied. "Some reporters are also asking who helped you at the hospital." Rebecca remained silent for a few seconds. She remembered the man in the emergency room. Calm eyes, a steady voice. "You're going to see the sunrise." Daniel looked at her, waiting for an answer. "Should we mention the security guard?" he asked. "I heard he was the one who—" "No," Rebecca cut him off. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough to make Daniel stop. "Just say the medical team handled everything professionally." Daniel nodded immediately. "Of course." He quickly typed a note into his tablet and left the room. The room became quiet again. Rebecca sat there for several more minutes, staring out the window. For some reason, the decision she had just made her feel slightly uncomfortable. At that same moment, downstairs in the hospital, Michael Carter had just begun his next shift. He walked along the familiar hallway, the small radio clipped to his shoulder still emitting faint static. A young nurse named Jenny hurried over. "Hey, Michael," she said. "The CEO from last night, Rebecca Lawson, she was asking about you this morning." Michael paused for a second. "Is she okay?" "Yeah," Jenny smiled. "She's fine. You should say hi. She probably wants to thank you." Michael shook his head gently. "I'm sure she's busy." He adjusted the security jacket on his shoulder. "I've got rounds to do." But as he turned the corner near the elevator, he suddenly stopped. Rebecca Lawson was standing there, leaning lightly on a small crutch, speaking with Daniel. Their eyes met. For a brief moment, neither of them said anything. Then Rebecca called out to him. "Wait, you're Michael, right?" Michael turned back. "Yes, ma'am." Rebecca slowly walked toward him. The entire hallway seemed quieter than usual. "I wanted to thank you for last night," she said. Michael nodded slightly. "Just doing my job." A short silence followed. Daniel stepped a little closer, lowering his voice to Rebecca, but still loud enough for Michael to hear. "The PR team suggests we don't build a narrative around this." Rebecca hesitated for a second, then she looked at Michael. "I appreciate what you did," she said, her voice calm but colder than before. "But I'd prefer if last night stayed private." Michael looked at her for a few seconds. Not angry, not disappointed, just a deep look that suddenly made Rebecca feel a little smaller. He said, "Wasn't planning to talk about it." Rebecca nodded slightly. "Good." Then Michael added one more sentence before turning away. "Then don't worry about owing me." He paused for half a second. "Just make the life you got count." And then he walked down the hallway. Rebecca stood there without moving. For some reason. That sentence made her heart feel heavier than the accident the night before. After that brief meeting in the hallway that day, Rebecca Lawson's life seemed to return to its familiar rhythm. Board meetings, thick financial reports, media interviews are carefully scripted down to every word. On the outside, everything continued as usual. But somewhere in her mind, Michael's words remained. Just make the life you got count. Rebecca had heard countless pieces of advice in her life, from business advisors, from powerful investors, from the father who had once run the company empire before passing it on to her. But no sentence had made her think as much as that one. Perhaps because it came from someone who needed nothing from her. One afternoon, a few days after being discharged from the hospital, Rebecca was sitting in her high-rise office at Lawson Biotech, looking down at the busy traffic flowing through Chicago. Daniel walked in with a stack of documents in his hands. "Miss Lawson, this is the list of community projects the foundation is considering this quarter." Rebecca flipped through several pages. The familiar proposals appeared: hospital funding, education programs, medical research grants. Large numbers, carefully prepared plans. But then Rebecca suddenly remembered something. She looked up. "Daniel." "Yes?" "The school near Mercy General. Do you know it?" Daniel thought for a few seconds. "Jefferson Elementary?" Rebecca nodded slightly. "I want the foundation to fund a new STEM lab there." Daniel looked a little surprised. "STEM lab?" "Yes," Rebecca spoke slowly. "Computers, tablets, science equipment, whatever they need." Daniel quickly made a note. "I'll make it happen." Rebecca said nothing more. She did not explain the reason, but in her mind, the image of a little girl sitting in the hospital cafeteria with a notebook filled with drawings of stars appeared. She remembered Michael mentioning his daughter, Lily. A few weeks later, the news reached Jefferson Elementary School. A brand new STEM lab would be built, complete with tablets, scientific equipment, and modern learning software. On the day the announcement was made, teachers and students nearly burst with excitement. That afternoon, Lily ran toward Michael in the hospital cafeteria, breathing fast with excitement. "Dad! Dad!" Michael had just walked in after finishing his shift. "What happened, kiddo?" Lily grabbed his hand, her eyes shining. "Guess what? Our school is getting a brand new computer lab." Michael smiled. "That's amazing." "Teacher said it's from a company called Lawson Foundation." Michael paused for the briefest moment. Lily kept talking, almost jumping with joy. "We're getting tablets and everything. Everyone was cheering." Michael glanced up through the large hospital windows. Across the street, a black sedan was slowly moving along the road. For a very brief moment, he saw Rebecca Lawson sitting in the back seat. Their eyes met through the car window, just 1 second. Then the car blended into the heavy traffic of Chicago. Lily tugged his hand. "Dad?" Michael looked down. "Yes." Lily asked a very simple question. "Do you think she's a good person?" Michael looked toward the car that had already disappeared at the end of the street. He thought for a moment. Then he smiled gently. "I think." He lifted Lily, holding her on his hip the way he used to when she was smaller. "People show gratitude in different ways." Lily tilted her head. "What does that mean?" Michael looked toward the sky, which was slowly turning orange as the sun set. "It means Sometimes people say thank you with words. He began walking slowly toward the parking lot. And sometimes they say it with what they do afterwards. Lily wrapped her arms around her father's neck. I think both matter. Michael chuckled softly. You're smarter than most adults, kiddo. The two of them continued walking under the fading evening light. Michael did not turn back to look at the road behind them. For him, the most important thing was not who had repaid a favor, but the little girl was smiling beside him. Yet somewhere in this vast city, Rebecca Lawson still remembers one sentence very clearly. Make the life you got count. And perhaps she had only just begun to understand what it truly meant. 1 month after the accident, Mercy General Hospital held its annual fundraising gala. It was one of the hospital's biggest events of the year. The grand hall was decorated with warm golden lights. Round tables were covered with pristine white cloths, champagne glasses sparkling beneath crystal chandeliers. Doctors, donors, business leaders, and city officials chatted as soft piano music drifted through the room. At the far end of the hall, near a marble wall, Michael Carter stood quietly in his security uniform. His job tonight was very simple. Check guest credentials, watch the entrances and exits, and make sure everything remained safe. As usual, he tried not to draw attention. Michael was used to standing at the edge of events like this, where the spotlight shone on important people while he was simply part of the background. A moment later, the large doors of the ballroom opened. Almost every head turned toward the entrance. Rebecca Lawson stepped inside. She wore a deep blue evening gown, simple yet elegant. There wasn't much jewelry, just a thin necklace and the confident gaze of a CEO accustomed to standing in front of hundreds of cameras. People around her quickly approached to greet her. Rebecca, good to see you again. Your foundation is doing incredible work. Rebecca smiled politely, shaking hands with each of them. Across the room, Michael saw her, just a glance. He did not walk over. There was no reason to. For him, this was simply another shift. The gala began. After a few short speeches from the hospital leadership, Rebecca stepped onto the stage. The microphone was adjusted slightly lower. She looked across the crowded room. Tonight, she began, we celebrate a place that saves lives every single day. Her voice was clear and steady. Mercy General isn't just a hospital. It's a community. The room listened in silence. Rebecca continued. And the Lawson Foundation is proud to pledge $5 million to expand emergency care services. Applause filled the hall. Michael remained at his position, quietly observing. But then, the lights in the room flickered once, then a second time. A moment later, an alarm tone sounded. A wave of confusion spread through the crowd. People turned their heads looking around. A panicked voice came from the left side of the hall. Someone collapsed! The music stopped. Several people stepped back, forming an open circle on the floor. An older man, around 70, lay motionless on the ground. His face was pale, not breathing. For a few brief seconds, the crowd froze. No one knew what to do. And then Michael moved before anyone else could react. He pushed through the crowd quickly and decisively, dropping to his knees beside the man. 2 fingers pressed against the man's neck. No pulse. Michael acted immediately. Call 911. He tilted the man's head back to open the airway. Then he began CPR. 1, 2, 3. The steady rhythm of chest compressions echoed through the silent room. 30 compressions, 2 breaths. Michael worked with absolute focus. No panic, no hesitation. Only the familiar rhythm of movements was etched deeply into his memory. Up on the stage, Rebecca stood frozen, her eyes locked onto the man kneeling in the middle of the crowd. She watched the way Michael moved, the way he controlled the situation, the way he stayed calm while the entire room was panicking. In that moment, Rebecca suddenly realized something she had never truly considered before. That man was not just a security guard. Michael continued the compressions. Come on. 15 seconds. 30 seconds. Then suddenly, the man on the floor coughed. The air in the room seemed to release all at once. A few people let out relieved breaths. Michael slowly stopped, keeping a hand on the man's shoulder. Sir, stay with me. Help is coming. The distant sound of an ambulance siren grew louder. Michael stood up, brushing lightly at his knees, as usual. He prepared to step back into the crowd, but when he looked up, he met Rebecca Lawson's gaze. She was standing at the edge of the stage, looking at him. Not with the gaze of a CEO observing an incident, but with the gaze of someone who had just realized that the man she once asked to stay silent was actually the man this entire room now owed a life. After the gala that night, Rebecca Lawson barely slept. The scene in the ballroom kept replaying in her mind. The older man was lying motionless on the floor. The crowd stepped back in panic. And Michael Carter, kneeling in the middle of it all, calm as if the world around him had disappeared. There had been no hesitation, no panic, only precise, decisive movements, as if he had done it hundreds of times before. Rebecca sat in her office on the top floor of Lawson Biotech, looking out at the city of Chicago, still glowing with lights past midnight. One question kept repeating in her mind. Who was that man, really? The next morning, Rebecca returned to Mercy General Hospital, not as a patient, not as a donor, but with a question that still had no answer. She walked straight into the hospital's human resources office. The HR manager looked slightly surprised to see her. Miss Lawson, is everything all right? Rebecca nodded lightly. I need to see the personnel file for someone on your security team. Who? Michael Carter. The manager hesitated for a moment. According to policy, personnel records were not always shared easily, but Rebecca Lawson was not an ordinary person. She was the hospital's largest donor. A few minutes later, Rebecca was sitting in a small conference room with a thin file in front of her. She opened the first page. Michael Carter. Age, 42. Position, night security officer. Rebecca flipped to the next page. The section titled Previous Employment. She stopped. United States Army, combat medic. Rebecca lifted her head slightly as if needing a second to make sure she had read it correctly. She continued reading. Deployment, Afghanistan, multiple tours. Then the next line. Bronze Star with Valor, Purple Heart. Rebecca's hand paused on the page. She kept turning the pages. A scanned copy of an old newspaper article was clipped into the file. The headline at the top of the page read, Army Medic Saves 23 Soldiers During Ambush. Rebecca read slowly, line by line. The article described an ambush in a valley in Afghanistan. Michael's unit had been attacked unexpectedly. Several soldiers were severely wounded. While most people were trying to retreat, Michael Carter had run back and forth through gunfire multiple times, pulling injured soldiers out of the danger zone one by one. He bandaged wounds, administered 5-5 fluids, even performed field emergency treatment right on the ground covered with sand and gun smoke. And he refused to leave until the last soldier had been lifted onto the rescue helicopter. Rebecca placed her hand over her mouth. In her mind, a familiar sentence echoed again. Just make the life you got count. The man who had said those words was not just a security guard. He was someone who had placed his life before others again and again. Rebecca looked again at the photo attached to the file. A much younger Michael Carter, wearing a military uniform, medals pinned across his chest. His eyes were sharp but calm. Rebecca exhaled slowly. A heavy feeling rose inside her chest. She remembered the brief conversation in the hospital hallway. I'd prefer if last night stayed private. She had said that to someone like him, someone who had saved her, someone who had saved dozens of others before that. Rebecca closed the file. The room was so quiet she could hear the clock ticking on the wall. Several minutes passed. Then Rebecca lifted her head, her eyes no longer the same, no longer the cold gaze of a CEO calculating a business decision. It was the look of someone who had just realized she had completely misunderstood a person. Rebecca stood up. She picked up the file, looking at the name on the cover one more time. Michael Carter. Then she spoke softly, almost to herself. I owe him more than silence. And in that moment, Rebecca Lawson decided that her PR team would almost certainly never approve. But sometimes, the right thing to do is the one thing that isn't written in any strategy. The next morning at Lawson Biotech's headquarters, an urgent press conference was held. There had been no prior announcement. No schedule was prepared weeks in advance. This left Rebecca Lawson's communications team almost in a state of panic. Daniel Brooks walked behind her into the press room, his voice filled with concern. Rebecca, we haven't prepared a message. The press will ask a lot of questions. Rebecca paused for a second before stepping up to the podium. I don't need a prepared message. Daniel looked at her as if he had never heard her say that before. Just turn the cameras on. A few minutes later, the room was packed with reporters. Cameras, microphones, laptops are already open. News had spread quickly through Chicago's media circles that Rebecca Lawson had an important announcement. When Rebecca stepped up to the podium, the entire room fell silent. She carried no notes, no printed speech, only a deep breath before she began. 1 month ago, I was involved in a car accident. Pens began moving across notebooks. That night, I was brought to Mercy General Hospital in critical condition. Rebecca paused for a moment. I almost died. The room grew even quieter. The person who saved my life was not a doctor. Several reporters lifted their heads. Not a famous surgeon. Rebecca looked straight into the row of cameras. He was a single father, working as a night security guard at the hospital. Soft murmurs began to ripple through the room. Rebecca continued. His name is Michael Carter. At that exact moment, in the cafeteria of Mercy General Hospital, Michael Carter was sitting across from Lily, helping her solve a fraction problem in her math notebook. His phone vibrated on the table. A message from a coworker appeared. Dude, turn on the TV, right now. Michael frowned slightly. In the corner of the room, the wall-mounted television was playing a local news channel. Rebecca Lawson appeared on the screen. Michael slowly looked up. Lily followed his gaze. Dad, is that her? On the screen, Rebecca continued speaking. Michael Carter used to be a combat medic in the U.S. Army. The reporters in the press room began whispering. He served multiple deployments in Afghanistan. A photo of Michael in his military uniform appeared on the screen behind Rebecca. Lily's eyes widened. Dad, that's you! Michael froze slightly. Rebecca continued, her voice no longer carrying the cold tone typical of her past press conferences. He saved dozens of soldiers on the battlefield. And that night, he saved me. She paused for a second. I asked him to keep that quiet. In the press room, camera flashes burst. Rebecca looked directly into the camera. Because at that moment, I didn't understand who I was speaking to. In the hospital cafeteria, people began turning to look at Michael. Several nurses recognized him. Rebecca took a deep breath. Michael Carter reminded me of something that I think many of us often forget. Her voice slowed. Leadership isn't about power. Leadership is about service. The The press room became completely silent. Rebecca looked into one of the cameras as if she somehow knew Michael might be watching somewhere. "Michael Carter?" Her voice softened. "If you're watching, please stand up." In the cafeteria, Lily tugged at her father's hand. "Dad, she's talking to you." Michael shook his head gently. "I don't need this." But Lily wrapped her arms around his arm. "She just wants to say thank you." On the screen, Rebecca continued. "There are people who save your life once." She blinked, her voice trembling slightly. "And there are people who make you look at yourself again." Rebecca placed her hands on the podium. "Michael Carter, I owe you an apology." The entire press room fell silent. Then she said a simple sentence. "I'm sorry." In the hospital cafeteria, people began to applaud. Lily hugged her father tightly. "Dad, everyone's clapping for you." Michael looked up at the screen. Rebecca was stepping away from the podium, but before turning away, she looked straight into the camera one more time. She didn't say anything else. Her lips formed two words. "Thank you." And for the first time in many years, Michael Carter felt that perhaps sometimes the quietest stories also deserve to be told. After the press conference that day, Michael Carter's life changed in a way he had never expected. For many years, he had grown used to living quietly behind the spotlight, a night security guard walking through the long hallways of the hospital, doing his job well, and then returning home with his daughter when the sun began to rise. But this time, the entire city of Chicago seemed to know his name. The news spread quickly across local television channels. Online news sites began reposting the story. Night security guard who saved CEO revealed as decorated war medic. Veteran hero working quietly in Chicago hospital. Michael's phone rarely stopped vibrating. Calls from reporters, interview invitations from television programs. Even private security companies were offering him positions with salaries 3 times higher than his current salary. One evening, after Michael finished his shift and sat with Lily in the hospital cafeteria, he glanced at the long list of missed calls on his phone and shook his head gently. Lily looked up from her notebook. "Dad, why don't you answer them?" Michael smiled softly. "Because I don't need to become famous." Lily thought about it for a moment. "But they're saying you're a hero." Michael gently ruffled her hair. "The real heroes usually don't get to come home, kiddo." Lily looked at her father, her eyes more serious than usual. "But you did." Michael didn't answer right away. He smiled. Maybe she was right. Among the many job offers Michael received, he declined almost all of them. But one offer made him pause and think. An email from the Lawson Foundation. It wasn't a glamorous position, just a role as an advisor on safety and emergency medical preparedness for the foundation's community projects. Flexible hours, no need to leave the hospital, and most importantly, Michael could still spend most of his time with Lily. 3 days later, Rebecca Lawson personally came to the hospital. There was no large group of assistants, no reporters, just her walking into the small office of the hospital's security department. Michael was sitting behind his desk reviewing the duty schedule. The soft knock sounded on the door. He looked up. Rebecca stood in the doorway. "Miss Lawson." She gently shook her head. "Just Rebecca." Michael nodded slightly. Rebecca stepped inside and closed the door behind her. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Finally, Rebecca spoke first. "I want to apologize to you. One more time." Michael tilted his head slightly. "You already did that in front of the entire city." Rebecca gave a faint smile. "That one was for the public." She looked directly at him. "This one is for you." Michael said nothing. Rebecca sat down in the chair across from him. "I was wrong about you," she said slowly. "Completely wrong." Michael shrugged lightly. Maybe you just didn't look closely enough. Rebecca studied him for a moment. Why didn't you tell me you used to be a combat medic? Michael smiled, the smile a little tired but sincere. Because it doesn't matter. Rebecca frowned slightly. It doesn't matter? Michael looked toward the small window behind the office. The real heroes are the ones who didn't come back. The words made Rebecca fall silent. After a few seconds, she placed an envelope on the table. That's an official invitation from the Lawson Foundation. Michael opened it and skimmed through the letter. Rebecca added, We want you to help design safety programs for communities and train medical staff in emergency response. Michael folded the letter again. Lily needs a stable life. Rebecca nodded. I know. Michael looked at her for another moment, then he said, If this job allows me to still be there for my daughter. He placed the letter back on the desk. Then I'll take it. Rebecca smiled. Not the smile of a CEO who had just secured a major deal, but the smile of someone who understood that sometimes the right decision can change more lives than you ever expect. 1 year had passed since the fateful rainy night on Lakeshore Drive. Chicago entered a cold but crystal clear winter morning. The sky was so bright that the early sunlight reflected off the tall glass skyscrapers, making them look like giant mirrors. On a quiet street in the center of the city, in front of a newly completed building, hundreds of people had gathered. Young families, doctors, veterans, and people who once had no access to medical care. On the large sign in front of the building, a name was engraved. Carter Center for Community Care. A new community health center built to provide free medical services, psychological support for veterans, and emergency first aid training for the public. In the center of the courtyard, a small stage had been set up. Rebecca Lawson stood in front of the microphone. But today, she was not wearing her usual powerful business suit. Just a simple, light gray outfit. No company logo, no media spotlight. Just a woman speaking to her community. Rebecca looked across the crowd before beginning. 1 year ago, I almost died. The space became quiet, and the person who saved my life was not a famous doctor. She turned slightly toward the side of the stage. He was simply a good man. Rebecca smiled. Michael Carter. The crowd turned to look toward the back. Michael stood near the last row of chairs, looking slightly uncomfortable as all the attention shifted toward him. Lily stood beside him and immediately nudged his back. Dad, they're calling you. Michael gently shook his head, but Lily grabbed his hand and pulled him forward. He stepped onto the stage, slightly awkward in front of the microphone. I'm not used to speaking in front of crowds, Michael said, making several people laugh softly. I'm usually more used to listening, to heartbeats. The atmosphere warmed. Michael looked down at the crowd, then he spoke slowly. If there's one thing I've learned in my life, he paused for a moment. It's that healing isn't only for the wounded. Healing is for anyone who still cares enough to help someone else. Rebecca stood beside him, listening. Michael continued. Every one of us carries scars. Some people choose to build walls to hide them. He glanced toward Lily, then back to the crowd. But I think we should build bridges so we can walk across them. Applause began slowly, then grew louder. Lily ran onto the stage and hugged her father. In her hand was a crayon drawing. In the picture, Michael was kneeling beside a woman lying on a stretcher, his jacket draped over her. At the center of the drawing was a large, glowing heart. Rebecca stepped forward, holding a small wooden box. She opened it. Inside was a simple medal engraved with a line of text. Rebecca pinned it onto Michael's jacket. Then she said quietly, That night you told me I would see the sunrise. Her voice trembled slightly. Since that day, I've seen hundreds of sunrises. Rebecca looked directly at him. And every sunrise reminds me why I'm still here. Michael said nothing. He looked at the sunlight pouring through the glass windows behind the building. A new sunrise. Perhaps that sentence from that night had never really been only about survival. Sometimes being saved isn't just about breathing. It's about learning how to live differently. Michael once said something very simple. Make the life you got count. And sometimes, one small act of kindness can change more lives than we ever imagine. Real heroes rarely step onto the stage. They appear at the right moment, do what needs to be done, and quietly move forward. If today's story reminded you that kindness still exists somewhere in this world, share it with someone you think might need to hear it too. And if you want to continue discovering stories that touch the human heart, stay with Deep Life Tales, because the next story might be the one you've been waiting for all along.